In 1630, a fleet of ships arrived in Boston. They carried Puritans who were escaping the harsh religious prejudices of England. Among these Puritans was John Winthrop, who would later become the first governor of Massachusetts. Along with him was Robert and Joanna Cutler Hale, who settled in Charlestown. Mr. Hale became a member of the church in Charlestown between July and October of 1632. On June 3, 1636, Mr. and Mrs. Hale gave birth to a son, John Hale.
John Hale was a native-born New Englander. He was born actually in what is now Charlestown, and his father was a blacksmith, I believe.
Robert Hale was appointed as one of 2 deacons in the community. Young John Hale attended many religious events with his father. When he was 12, the 2 of them prayed for Margaret Jones, an accused witch. This was John Hale's first encounter with witchcraft.
The first witch was Margaret Jones, who was a healer, a midwife, and quite proficient in her profession. But she had quarreled with a neighbor, or the neighbor had quarreled with her, and something had happened to the neighbor's animals, and they suspected witchcraft.
This had a profound effect on John Hale, which he would later write about.
The day of her execution, I went in company of some neighbors who took great pains to bring her to confession and repentance, but she constantly professed herself innocent of that crime, and so she said unto her death.
It was the custom in some families for the eldest son to be given a college education. John Hale was fitted for college by the teacher of the church in Charlestown, Reverend Allen, who was the successor to the Reverend John Harvard.
And this is something he does. He goes to Harvard. He's rather a precocious young student, although, in fairness to him, he worked hard. He had to work his way through Harvard. He actually did chores and assisted in his hall. His mother actually made a little bit of extra money by supplying soup to student meals. And so that was something that I think sets him apart from so many of the more privileged members of the student body at Harvard in those days, is that he and his parents worked hard to get him through.
He studied the Greek myths and the Roman myths, and particularly the Old Testament, where they spoke of witches.
Of course, the verse you most often read is Exodus chapter 22, verse 18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." It was dealt with pretty harshly, and he accepted that.
In Hale's first year at Harvard, in 1653, he witnessed the execution of Anne Hibbins, another woman who had been accused of witchcraft. She was hanged on Boston Common for allegedly having preternatural knowledge.
And after graduating, he decided that he would attempt the job of being a teacher in Charlestown, first of all, and he starts working as a teacher. Then he does some guest preaching, and what happens, interestingly, he receives an invitation from a congregation that had just recently formed up in Beverly.
By 1664, Beverly, known then as the Bass River side of Salem, had already employed 2 religious teachers, both of whom proved unsatisfactory. The community's application to separate from Salem had been rejected by the Great and General Court, forcing its settlers to cross the river to receive communion at the church in Salem. In 1664, John Hale was asked to become the new teacher in Bass River Side.
And they asked him to come up and to be a guest minister, a guest preacher, and he does this. And they'd had some difficulties with their previous pastor, and he just, he wowed them.
John Hale worked primarily as a religious teacher in the community. Having the church provide for his domestic needs, Hale was able to settle down and marry.
He first married Rebecca Biley, who was the stepdaughter of the deputy governor from Ipswich.
And, you know, I've often wondered why he came to Ipswich, and then I realized that about a year before he got married, his mother got remarried to one of the original settlers of Ipswich for her second marriage. And so that he must have met people at that time.
John Hale provided the needed stability to an otherwise unstable community. As the community on the Bass River side of Salem continued to grow, it was becoming more difficult to make the treacherous Sunday journey to Salem town.
It was a hard trip. Think of the winter time when they didn't have raincoats. They had just the woolen things, and they had to go in their little shallops and cross the river and go to the church that was cold and stay all day.
Once the number of families living on the Bass River side was growing, they were very anxious to get their own church. And in order to do so, Salem Church had to allow them to break off and release the members living on this side so they could affiliate with the new church.
In the winter of 1666, the church organization at Bass River Side petitioned the Salem Church to become a church of their own. The petition was considered on July 4th of 1667, and with unanimous consent, Salem authorized the separate church at Bass River Side. On August 28th, the community renewed their call to Hale, this time to become their minister.
Ultimately, they extend to him an invitation to become their next minister. And he accepts the pastorate in Bass River.
When I look at the weight of the work you call me unto, I hope the Lord will enable me to practice accordingly.
After accepting the call to become minister, John Hale was ordained on September 20th, 1667. Reverend Hale now took his place with Roger Conant and others as one of the community's leaders. He had a prominent place in civic affairs as well as in the ministry. Shortly after his ordainment, Hale played a key role in the establishment of Beverly as a separate town.
He was the individual who helped to write the petition to the Massachusetts Great and General Court asking that this little community be set apart from Salem, of which it was a much larger part, and become its own separate town with its own meeting house and its own minister and its own identity.
On October 14th of 1668, the General Court authorized the separation. Bass River Side would then be known as Beverly, named after a cathedral town in Yorkshire, England. The establishment of Beverly as a town unto itself marked the beginning of a peaceful time in Reverend Hale's life. Reverend Hale and his wife Rebecca had recently welcomed a daughter, also named Rebecca, and would soon welcome a son, Robert. Hale's family, church, and town were all growing.
All of the historical records indicate that he was a fairly well-liked person, fair, firm, and well-liked.
He was able to win the confidence and the love of the people in this neighborhood, and they took very good care of him. They appointed people to build his barn. They appointed people to cut his wood.
They gave him tremendous advantages. In fact, ultimately the parsonage, which of course was owned by the church in those days, as was always the custom, still is in many cases, they wanted him to remain. And so as a condition of his continued attendance on the church and preaching with the churches, they offered him the ownership of the parsonage for himself and his heirs in perpetuity. What we today call the Hale House and the Hale property, which is still there. Of course, in those days it was a lot larger. It was a large farm of approximately a 200-acre spread that actually went all the way down to the edge of the ocean. And you could see the ocean from the house, and there were fields and cultivation and herds and so forth. And so he was a bit of a farmer too. In that respect, he had a pretty good investment in terms of his land and his property.
The exact location of the original house has been the subject of local controversy. Some historians point to town documents showing the existence of an original parsonage located on top of Watch Hill.
There was something in the town records about a half house, and there seems to be some speculation that that the Hales might have originally lived on what's now Watch Hill, up behind the common, and that the house, the half house, might have been moved to its present location and then added to.
Other historians believe differently.
I really believe that the present house is the original house, the 1657 house that was added onto.
It seems to be a matter of dispute, and again, whether that will ever be solved, I don't know.
Almost every generation to live in the house after Reverend John Hale would make changes or additions to it. Some of the most notable additions are the extension on what is now the Hale Street side of the house, the apartment added to it, and a porch on the second floor.
What makes it so interesting is that the present house reflects the three periods in its history, the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
Also reflecting a history spanning 3 centuries is the church founded by Reverend Hale. Although not the original building, the history of the first parish church is well preserved. In Hale's time, it was important to maintain spiritual stability, especially in an era of daily hardships.
Life was harsh at times, especially since they had the Indian menace to the north and to the west of them, and every once in a while this menace would flare up.
In 1675, Metacomet, the son of Massasoit, whom the Puritans called King Philip, took over in the Narragansett region south of Plymouth. Metacomet was very much alienated from the Puritans as a result of several land disputes.
So finally he decides, look, every time we turn around, these white people are taking more and more land. If we keep letting them do this, eventually we will be displaced. Well, he launches a war unlike anything the Puritans had seen. In every Puritan pulpit, the question was asked, why are our towns being sacked and burned? Why are our citizens being slaughtered? Why are the Indians, basically, why are they being allowed to win? They've never won before. God has been on our side, and Puritan ministers have the answer. Well, the answer is, because you people have turned your back on your faith. Turn back to God, and these Indians will be beaten. But if you don't, God will punish us the way he punished the ancient Israelites.
Puritan forces were eventually put together, and King Philip was killed. While there would be no more Indian uprisings of this caliber until the 18th century, Reverend John Hale had to battle trouble in his own home. Margaret Lord, who was the live-in maid at the Hale residence, was caught stealing food.
He found that not only was Margaret Lord stealing things, but she was stealing food and taking it, put into the barn, and the Dorcas Hoare's children were coming and picking up the food and articles that she hid for them.
It was stealing everything. I mean, even stealing the cream off the milk, and money and clothes and food.
Reverend Hale's daughter, Rebecca, had known for a while about Margaret Lord's thievery. She had been coerced by the housemaid into keeping silent, but little Rebecca would later offer testimony against her.
I have known of the naughty doings of our maid, Margaret Lord, a great while, but I was afraid to tell my mother of them, lest Margaret Lord should kill me, for she threatened if I told of her tricks she would burn me with the marking iron, and she kept a rope in the hay to hang me with if I told. And many times she held me over the well to affright me. Once she put me in the bucket of the fore-well and let me down to the bottom. I told her if she killed me, it would be discovered. She answered she would burn my body in the fire. She said she had a book in which she could read and call the devil.
When Hale found out about it, he could have had her arrested. He could have done many things, but he attempted to soothe his little daughter's feelings and tried to persuade her not to have such hard feelings against Margaret Lord.
Margaret Lord ran away, never to be heard from again. However, Dorcas Hoare, who was receiving the stolen goods from Margaret Lord, was eventually summoned, with her family, to court in Ipswich, a few miles north of Beverly. The children of Dorcas Hoare were infuriated and rounded up Reverend Hale's cows, killing one and severely injuring another.
And when those cows were beaten and one died, he said, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." So it seems to me that he was an accepting person for the things that happened to him.
Hale's acceptance of tragedy would later be tested. Little Rebecca would die of tuberculosis at the age of 15. Not long afterwards, in 1683, his wife Rebecca would also die. Hale, in keeping with the traditions of the day, married again.
His second wife was Sarah Noyes. Sarah Noyes' father was the first teacher in Newbury.
Sarah Noyes Hale was raised to be the wife of a minister, just as John Hale was raised to be a minister. And so I think it was just destined that she would be in her place when that happened.
And she was the youngest of the Noyes family, and was well on her way to being an old maid when Reverend Hale's first wife died and he married her. And yeah, I've always wondered how they got together. Sarah Noyes' brother was a minister in Salem, so perhaps that was one of the connections. And in the second marriage, there were 4 children.
The children of Hale's second marriage included James, Samuel, Joanna Cutler, and John. During the late 1680s, there was much political disdain for the ruler of New England. On December 21st, 1686, Edmund Andros arrived in Boston and at once put into place a number of measures that were extremely obnoxious to the colonists.
He wants to break their pride, remove from them their right to rule themselves. There will be no more governors elected by the colonies. They will not have the right to elect their own rulers. He has been appointed by the king to be president of the Commonwealth of New England.
This type of dictatorship did not fare well with the Puritans, who had come to revere the freedom of their religious lifestyle.
In a year, he's booted. He's basically removed. When William and Mary come in the Glorious Revolution, 1688, of course, they're placed on the throne. He is removed. And they settle back into normalcy for only a brief time.
On a stormy day in 1689, Reverend John Hale experienced a brush with death.
That was a day that he had the deacon to come and discuss church business with him. So they went upstairs to his study. It began to storm.
There was a violent thunderstorm and lightning hit the chimney while he was in his office, and damaged the chimney quite badly, split the staircase, and there's a fairly lengthy handwritten account in his handwriting to his brother in Charleston of what happened.
As we came to the head of the stairs, we were both struck with lightning in our right arms and right legs, yet neither of us heard ye thunder or saw ye lightning. I was struck down upon my knees by ye post we used to lay hands on. I was unable to stir for some time, but heard my family crying out of hurt below. At last I got down, my foot as it were dead, and leg full of pain, but with help I got to lie down on a bed, with elbows seemed out of joint, An arm hung down like a stick, with much pain in it, but my fingers seemed dead. I have a bruise on my face, but I suppose it might be from my fall. In less than an hour, I found life in all my limbs, and that no bones were broken.
Someone who obviously would be looking for signs from heaven, it must have been quite a jolt. Would have been for anyone, but he must have wondered, is someone sending me a message here?
The handrail that Reverend Hale and the deacon had been using to come down the stairs had been split into 3 pieces by the lightning. The chimney had been shattered in some places, sending bricks raining down into the house. Reverend Hale recovered from this near-death experience and lived on to continue to give to the growing community of Beverly.
He seemed to get along well with the people in the community. He seemed to be the right temperament and had a fairly long, active ministry in Beverly.
He negotiates a number of disputes in the town. He's very wise. He's very well liked. He's a great diplomat. Just generally a very successful pastorate for about 25 years.
In 1689, the neighboring town of Salem welcomed its new minister, the Reverend Samuel Parris.
And he comes with his family, his niece Abigail Williams, his daughter Elizabeth, his wife Elizabeth. And who's there at his ordination? You know, Reverend John Hale. And you can almost expect that these two fellows are going to get together as colleagues, as fellow ministers, and become at least on a superficial level friends and acquaintances.
The clerical class was a class of people who knew each other because many of them had attended Harvard, to what we would today call the Divinity School. And they had a lot of social gatherings. They had a lot of gatherings of religious purposes.
In 1690, the General Court ordered an expedition against the French in Canada. They invited Reverend Hale to join as a chaplain.
And you didn't just send men off to fight without spiritual guidance. So obviously they needed a chaplain, and someone apparently suggested, well, why don't we send John Hale?
John Hale was called to serve as a chaplain, and the church didn't want him to go, but he went anyway, against their wishes.
His congregation was very upset, and they wrote a very moving letter to the governor to let him stay at home.
Hale's parish disapproved of the court's request and appointed Samuel Corning, John Hill, Peter Woodbury, Thomas West, Nehemiah Grover, and Andrew Elliott to a committee to submit reasons to the court for their disapproval.
Our pastor's absence will make us a sheep without a shepherd.
We don't think the good Reverend's bodily strength is adequate for such an expedition.
We are liable to suffer by enemies, and we desire the presence of our pastor as a comforter and encourager in such a case.
I know that they were very alarmed that here they were going to be at home without his care. It was as if some member of the family was being taken away from them.
And they protested it quite adamantly, but it didn't do any good. They said, "Pack up, John, you're going."
Reverend Hale served as a chaplain on board the ship Six Friends during the expedition by sea against Quebec. In his absence, Hale's 22-year-old son Robert served as interim pastor of the church in Beverly.
He was captured by the French in 1690 in that expedition, was held prisoner for a while and then released. And they did capture Port Royal, and it was later given back to the French in the Treaty of '97.
Within months of Hale's return to Beverly, something happened which would change his life and history forever.
In 1692, probably January, absolutely by February, some strange things were happening in the minister's parsonage at Salem Village.
The girls who were living in the Paris household started to experiment with the fortune-telling games they were learning from their maidservant, Tituba.
And the girls start to really become intrigued with what we would call perhaps white magic or fortune-telling. And although in the 20th century context that might not be seen as a terrible thing, in the context of the 17th century, and certainly by the standards of the teachings of Christianity as Reverend Paris would know it, and as Reverend John Hale would know it, this was something that children shouldn't be dabbling in. It's something that people, Christians, ought not to be trying to tell the future. And they start to act very strangely. They start to behave in a very aberrant way.
The girls in the Paris household, as well as several others who lived in the neighborhood, started going into fits, into postures which were unnatural, and were starting to do things that were kind of strange.
When doctors examine them, they cannot find anything physically wrong with them. They rule out mental illness, they rule out epilepsy, they rule out several ailments that they could be concerned with.
And who gets called to the house to help pray over the children but Reverend John Hale. He prays over the children, he examines the children, he asks them questions. He tries to help resolve the matter in a scriptural way, in a non-aggressive, non-confrontational way. And none of their efforts proved successful. I think he had a genuine concern that something terrible has taken place here, he didn't know what, in the Paris household, and he would help to find out what it was.
Many adults started hearing about it. As a matter of fact, one neighbor named Mary Sibley, who lived just down the road from the parsonage, decided that maybe this was diabolical, maybe something bad was happening. And she instructed the Indian slave of the Paris household to make a witch cake and to try to find out what was wrong with the girls.
Tituba made a witch cake of the children's urine and rye flour and cooked it and fed it to the dog. The dog was supposed to be a messenger of the devil.
When she did that, and when the minister found this out, what had been a bad situation in the household suddenly became profoundly bad, and that was because someone was introducing white witchcraft into the process. And Reverend Paris always, maybe as an excuse, but for whatever reason, always pointed this out as being the point in time when the devil was allowed to come into Salem Village.
The girls' first accusations of witchcraft were against Tituba, the Paris' slave who had entertained them with stories of magic, Sarah Good, a disenfranchised beggar woman, and Sarah Osborne, who was old and bedridden.
Although they begin accusing people who are disenfranchised from the community, they begin accusing people who are not necessarily popular. You know, there's so